I think I found why Brian Kohberger ultimately pled guilty. By the end of this video, you'll know the exact reason why too. You may be surprised that the reason that Mr. Kohberger pled guilty is that the prosecution was simply able to reasonably tie him to 1122 King Road on the night of the unalivings, and probably as far back as 8 November 2022. This linkage has nothing to do with CAS data, but with the capabilities of the particular make and model of Mr. Kohberger's phone while physically switched off. I'll demonstrate that the prosecution, and perhaps even Cy Ray, gave us all the clues that we needed if we chose to listen. Either way, Mr. Kohberger's final guilty plea was the result. As smart as Mr. Kohberger is, he didn't know enough about his own devices, and that is what ultimately sealed his fate. I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I've been intimately involved with corporate investigations, malware, insider threat, and other unique niche examinations involving mobile devices and their forensics for more than a decade, with deep experience that includes phones like Mr. Kohberger's. I also have no past or current connection professionally or personally with the case. Nothing I'm going to talk about is secret or close hold. It's functionality that has been openly advertised by the manufacturer. In my opinion, Cy Ray knew of this technology during his testimony. Steve G talked about it. And Bill Thompson confidently stated at the plea hearing that the prosecution's evidence will show that they can place him at 1122 King Road. We'll start with Bill Thompson to give us context.
And the state's evidence would show that the defendant's car came back and parked behind and above the 1122 King Road residence.
But wait, you're likely thinking two things right now. The first reason is the FBI and digital forensics consultants said they couldn't find any evidence on the phone, and you'd be right. The senior FBI digital forensic investigator has recently said there wasn't any evidence at all on the phone.
Yeah, for me, I touched on it a little bit. It was the lack of evidence that I was able to find on the phone.
Make sure, is physical analyzer missing it? Did we just not parse it? And then realizing very quickly, it's not there. There isn't anything to parse.
My response to that, built on years of hands-on experience with the same devices as Mr. Kohberger, is that not having the evidence on the phone is logical. The data in question simply isn't stored there. Give me a few more minutes and I'll explain why. The second reason is Mr. Kohberger's phone was physically switched off. So there is no digital data during the time frame of the unalivings. And you'd also be correct.
At 2 whatever in the morning, physically pressing the button on the side of his phone and that device powering off.
Believe it or not, this statement was the clincher for understanding the type of evidence that the prosecution likely found. In fact, you'll also see that they somewhat give themselves away with their vocabulary choices. So let's get into it. Clues that true crime influencers missed. I've spent time trying to reach out to true crime influencers and have been turned away. Probably the biggest reason is that Ann Taylor framed CAS data as the only way to geolocate devices. While I believe that Ann Taylor was ultimately out-lawyered like many public defenders, she did do a good job of keeping the focus on CAS data and making the case that Cy Ray is the expert on geolocation. She did her job. She kept the public focus squarely on the CAS data and away from any other digital evidence that might be prejudicial to her client. I don't know Cy Ray, he doesn't know me, but I like him from what I've seen online. He's a recognized expert in CAS data. We probably have adult beverages together and tell similar stories because we're very similar in the fact that we don't have an opinion about guilt or innocence without being led by facts. More importantly for the defense, the CAS data in Mr. Kohberger's case could never be truly prejudicial to the defendant. There simply wasn't CAS data placing him at the scene, so it's a sound strategy to keep public focus and trust on that approach, and solely on that approach. Because the public and true crime community were so well sold on the CAS data by Ann Taylor, no one accounted for the possibility that the FBI may have known the exact location of Brian Kohberger's phone through multiple other means. I've posted a number of comments saying this specifically on a number of YouTube videos. That said, the point came during Cy Ray's hearing where Ann Taylor had to account for what she called additional records. My opinion is that these were not cast records. In an exchange between Ann Taylor and Cy Ray that I believe is likely related to the other digital evidence, without stating so, Ann Taylor asks,
"Last week, we received some additional records that Detective Mowry found when he was preparing for his testimony on this mission to compel. Have you had a chance to review those?"
Notice that she uses the generic term additional records rather than additional cast records. It's reasonable to assume, since Ann Taylor has to be precise, that these are not cast records. Also, note how Cy Ray's body language visibly changes during his response.
Have you had a chance to review those records?
I have. A couple of them are very technical, so I'm not going to say that I've mastered them yet.
Here's a cast expert with 30 years or more of experience who is admitting that he hasn't mastered whatever kind of highly technical records Ann Taylor is referring to. If they were normal cast records, he would have had a much more comfortable response.
I have a good idea of what was provided and what it means.
Sounds like those might be pretty important to us defending Mr. Kohberger.
I could give examples, but I know it's a very technical thing, so I'm not. It could be extremely impactful to either side. I'm not saying just in defending Mr. Kohberger. It could be extremely impactful in prosecuting Mr. Kohberger.
The only type of evidence that could be impactful to prosecuting Mr. Kohberger is evidence from the crime scene. So we've learned from Cy Ray that there are highly technical records that are likely not cast records that has some chance of placing Mr. Kohberger at the crime scene. Another strong reason is we don't want to hear that Mr. Kohberger may have been at 1122 King Road after November 7th.
But there are some people who are so full of shit, it's unreal. They do not believe that Brian Kohberger is innocent of this crime. Absolutely don't.
Watch most YouTube creators on this topic, and they'll casually say that the prosecutors didn't have evidence of Mr. Kohberger being at 1122 King Road. That comes from hearing this quote from Bill Thompson.
Now, I will acknowledge also, we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times.
But that quote alone isn't quite correct. And the most important part of that statement by Bill Thompson usually isn't included. Let's look at the more complete statement.
Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times. Now, I will acknowledge also, we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times.
Here's what we know from Bill Thompson. We know that he wasn't at the property between 9 July and 7 November. The crime occurred on the night of 12 November. 7 November seems like a very specific date. Too specific for the prosecution to not have some kind of evidence to support it. So we have to be open to the possibility that Mr. Kohberger was at 1122 King Road, not only the night of the 12th, but also between the 8th and the 11th as well. The digital forensics consultants do provide another key clue to the evidence they found when they described Mr. Kohberger turning off his Wi-Fi a few days prior to the crime.
But then, right as we lead up to the days of the crime about to happen, he went in and turned off his Wi-Fi on his phone. So he didn't want it to connect to anything, which is quite odd.
While they aren't specific as to dates, this might align well with the 7 November date that Bill Thompson speaks about. So now let's look at how the digital forensics team and consultants likely found enough digital evidence for the period that Mr. Kohberger's Wi-Fi was turned off and later while his phone was physically turned off.
But how trustworthy are Cellbrite? How trustworthy are they? And how could you say that you believe or disbelieve certain elements, but then you turn around and say, well, I believe what Cellbrite say?
Without the full digital forensics report being released, if it is ever released, the most interesting feature on Mr. Kohberger's device is a feature called offline finding. Offline finding is not your traditional network. It's part of a proprietary manufactured network that informally connects nearby phones of the same make and model. It's specific to the type of phone that Mr. Kohberger carried. If the phones are properly configured, the direct, informal, and crowdsourced network that's built can include properly configured devices that even have been physically turned off or had their Wi-Fi disabled. This isn't some secret or undocumented feature. There have been YouTube videos posted about it for at least 2 years that describe its ability to find devices that have been physically turned off.
If you have a Samsung Galaxy device and you lose it, you can use Find My Device, but there's a more robust way to locate it, especially if someone turns it off. Go ahead and swipe down and click on the gear icon right here. Click on Search and go ahead and type in Offline Finding. Click on that, and then what you need to do is allow this phone to be found and do Remote Unlock, Send Last Location, and then click on Offline Finding. You also have the ability to help other people find their device.
Initially, I entertained the possibility that the functionality included smart TVs and other devices like thermostats made by the same manufacturer, but it doesn't. It's the same make and similar models that Mr. Kohberger had. If properly configured, any two compatible devices by that manufacturer can find each other. How? The phone devices have a special chip that remains active and doesn't power off until the battery is fully empty. The chip sends out what's called a Bluetooth low energy beacon that, when detected up to about 100 meters or 300 feet by another compatible device, which is in this case called a finder, it sends the information about that particular connection in an encrypted manner to the manufacturer. What's so important here is that there's a requirement for finder devices to be connected to the internet. The connection between the found device and the finder device occurs with no password or need to log into Wi-Fi. You can see in the interface that by enabling offline finding mode, that your device can both be found and function as a finder for this particular type of network. Since Mr. Kohberger's phone was either configured to have Wi-Fi turned off or was physically turned off, it could not have functioned as a finder during the 4 periods that he had no other discernible phone activity. Now, for online find to be effective and defendable, 4 conditions would have to be met for the feature. These conditions are: 1. Mr. Kohberger would have had to have enabled offline find in order to be transmitting the beacon. This requires a manual opt-in. Number 2, Mr. Kohberger's phone would have needed sufficient power for the offline find feature to stay enabled during the crime. Number 3, 1122 King Road, or a neighboring house to the place where Bill Thompson says he parked, would have had to have a compatible device close enough to capture the beacon and log it. Number 4, the digital forensics team would need to be able to test and replicate this feature so that they could present it in court and defend the results. So the big question is whether there is enough corroborating information to determine that these 4 conditions have been met. I believe there is. Let's start with Mr. Kohberger having enabled offline find and his phone capable of transmitting a beacon. From an investigative standpoint, the easiest way to find a beacon that works offline is to search for evidence of that beacon while the phone was known to be off. From the CAS data, we know that the focus of their search for the beacon was the 4 periods of inactivity that included the time frame around the unalivings.
The CAS team, so they do the mapping, the cellular mapping for the FBI. They had looked through his historical records and tried to pick out any time where his phone had a dead period, no activity, for at least the same amount of time as when it was powered off on this night. And so we had 4 different time periods to sort of go look at. But one of them was obviously when the homicides had occurred. So we didn't have to figure that part out. It was like this minute to that minute, and we had to figure out the things around it.
In the digital world, time frames are defined by timestamps, which mark each of the phone's individual activities by the time that it occurred. So the search would be from the start of the phone being turned off to the phone being turned back on.
in all the formats of timestamps to go look for that was within the scope of when this crime happened.
And since the phone was off, they'd have to find some evidence of activity, which the consultant interestingly refers to as files.
Really went digging into, again, just finding any timestamp that was associated to this moment. And we found a couple files.
Here's where I'll speculate that none of these searches were actually occurring on Mr. Kohberger's phone or a forensic image of the phone. Why such speculation? Timestamp searches are a basic skill of digital forensic investigators. An experienced team of investigators, such as like what was on this case, using modern forensics tools, would have certainly found evidence of these timestamps from Mr. Kohberger's phone image in prior examinations. The other reason is that, from my understanding, when Mr. Kohberger's device was physically powered off, only the special chip remained powered on while the rest of the phone systems were powered off. The probability of a forensic artifact of a connection being saved in the cloud is far higher than the power overhead that's required to save the artifact as a file on the phone. This would also somewhat explain why the consultant refers to the evidence as files. I just thought that was interesting. A logical next question would be where these files or external data may have come from. The FBI Digital Examiner alludes to how they may have received the files. Note the use of the term reaching back and how it's clear that reaching back is within the FBI and not within the consulting company.
We had the partnerships, we were reaching back for other capabilities, and that's certainly what you brought to the table, and you had your own reach back capabilities.
Why would they need to reach back into other assets within the FBI? There probably was a concern that Mr. Kohberger's technical skills exceeded the capabilities of the investigative team.
In victimology. So he had stuff on his phone that could be kind of devious, I guess I would say, but it also could be easily explainable as research for his doctoral program.
Especially since the combined team, with all of their collective experience, had never seen a device as modified as Mr. Kohberger's device.
So can any of you tell me, have you worked other cases where this has happened? The lack of evidence has become, the key evidence in a case.
For me, the short answer is no.
Never.
No, not like this.
A reasonable person might assume that the consultants performed the nitty-gritty analyst work of the specific files that were reviewed, but the files were actually collected from some sort of internal reach-back mechanism within the FBI and external partners.
When we showed up, Jeff handed us a piece of paper. It wasn't like we had to figure out where this time frame was.
Beautiful piece
It was
of paper.
the CAST team, so they do the mapping, the cellular mapping for the FBI. They had looked through his historical records and tried to pick out any time where his phone had a dead period, no activity, for at least the same amount of time as when it was powered off on this night. And so we had 4 different time periods to sort of go look at. But one of them was obviously when the homicides had occurred. So we didn't have to figure that part out. It was like this minute to that minute, and we had to figure out the things around it.
We've been talking about Bluetooth low energy beacons. I believe that the FBI investigator somewhat tells on himself here by actually using the word beacon.
So there was that beacon of, we need to look at this, but it was that deep dive that you needed to do that just doesn't come out with just general regular parsing.
The investigative team seems to have found evidence of a beacon in these files, which would meet the first of the 4 conditions. The second condition of Mr. Kohberger's phone was needing sufficient power for the offline find function to stay enabled during the crime. And that seems to be met in the simplest way. Mr. Kohberger turned his phone back on while still driving. That meant it still had battery.
When he turned it back on, we'd found another file that sort of does a, am I near Wi-Fi, and then he wasn't near any known Wi-Fi. So the log was, again, painting another picture, and CAST was able to say, all right, he's now hitting a tower that's way over here, he's not at home.
I'd suggest that the fact that Mr. Kohberger's phone still had battery is corroborated with oddly specific language from the consultant about the phone being 100% charged when turned off.
He was awake at 2 whatever in the morning, physically pressing the button on the side of his phone, and that device powering off while it was at 100% charge.
So the second condition appears to be met. The third condition is that there had to have been a compatible device of the same make and similar model close enough to capture the beacon to be logged. I don't know if you remember, several years ago, Steve Gonsalves, the father of Kaylee Gonsalves, set the true crime community alight when he talked about a connection between Mr. Kohberger's devices and the 1122 King Road residents.
Yeah, and close enough that he was touching their Wi-Fi. His phone was touching their Wi-Fi. Yeah.
While the online community speculated that Mr. Kohberger had somehow gained valid Wi-Fi credentials, or that law enforcement had found a forensic connection with one of the Bluetooth speakers in the residence, I, along with others, remained genuinely puzzled. Wi-Fi doesn't log connections without valid credentials, and Bluetooth speakers, from an investigative aspect, generally don't log any connections, even if successful. Steve Gonsalves' statement wasn't making sense to me at the time. But perhaps he just wasn't being precise in his technical terms, or someone knowingly changed the information that they provided to him. It made no sense to many people that understand how mobile devices perform handshakes with services, including me. But it does make more sense now. Mr. Gonsalves is clear that the connection was facilitated by the Wi-Fi at 1122 King Road. This means there likely was a device inside the property that was compatible. Prosecutors also seem to know that he was inside the house and didn't park in front. I'd speculate, given the relative popularity of Mr. Kohberger's phone model, that there may have been other finders within the required 100 meters that could place him at the parking area behind the home, but not see him during the entire time of the unalivings. By moving outside the radius of 100 meters, this would tell investigators where he actually parked. If nothing else, Mr. Gonsalves' statement helps us to corroborate the third condition. The fourth condition is that the need to be able to test the feature to replicate and defend the results is only included because there is evidence that will need to be included in a legal court proceeding. The investigators couldn't just describe something to a judge and jury. They had to be able to defend it through testing. The contractors talk about this part of the process. For instance, we know that the digital investigators held mock trials about the evidence.
Because when we were subpoenaed for 4 months, we were in the middle of personal stuff and moving all around, trying to do a mock trial, the three of us, to prepare, because everyone else is on the other side of the country.
We also know that they were able to test their findings about the phones, about this particular make and model of phone, as part of their testing.
One of the very fortunate things in this case was Heather had the exact phone model on the same carrier that BK had. So then we were able to do additional testing on these things and become confident in sort of the findings.
The fourth condition appears to be met. So what do all the data points tell us that helps place Mr. Kohberger at 1122 King Road? Nothing was available to be found with traditional digital forensics tools and approaches on the device. 4 periods of inactivity were searched that for sure included the phone being physically turned off and likely included the Wi-Fi being turned off. Some kind of evidence referred to as files was found that was not located on the device itself. And then the evidence was able to be tested and prepared for trial using a similar device. The offline finding feature fits each of these and is a high probability reason that the prosecutors likely felt that the evidence would show that Mr. Kohberger was at 1122 King Road during the unalivings.
You know, this is what built that solid case that really supported the DNA findings.
Listen again to this section of the panel discussion with the consultants. Knowing what you know now, and you'll understand better why they state a high level of confidence.
Right. So I think what that does for us is the defense might say, well, phones die when you're at home, asleep, forgot to plug it in, whatever. All of that was gone, right? We had him awake for sure, turning it off, and then a little over 2 hours later, turning it back on.
This, my friends, is the highest probability reason that we have to date as to why Mr. Kohberger pled guilty. If you like my content and how I present it, please subscribe. I'm a new channel. I can use your subscription. If you have questions, or concerns or you disagree, go ahead and place them in the comment and I'll respond. Have a great day.